Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. So I wanted to point out a couple of things that I noticed about the parable of the 10 virgins after I had done my previous video. And one of the things that I didn't get a chance to point out is over here where it says, they that were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. And if you look at the word took in the Greek, it actually means to receive, and I'll show you that. You can see that it says take over here, but it also means to proclaim, procure for oneself, to admit, to receive. And if you look at how many times it's used, you see that it's translated as receive 133 times and as take 106 times. So more often than not, it's used to mean receive rather to take. And even when it's used as to take, it actually means to receive, because this is actually a form of the same word that's used for taking communion, which is actually receiving communion. Okay, and I'll just show you where it means receive again. It means to admit, receive what is offered, to receive a person, to take, to choose, to receive what is given, to gain, to get. Okay, so I knew this word was a form of the word for taking communion in the Greek, but I couldn't remember what the exact word was. But every time I see this word lambano, it reminds me of taking communion, because that's the word that's used when communion is given in the Greek Orthodox Church. And so I couldn't remember the exact word. It wasn't coming to mind readily. So what I did is I just copy and pasted this word. So I just put in that word and then the word communion, and then I scrolled down and I noticed the word that I was trying to think of, which was this word, which is metalambano. Okay, so I just copy and pasted that word, and you can see that that means to receive communion. Okay, and I'll just show it to you in the Strong's. It's Strong's number 3335, and you can see it means I share and partake of, and it means to receive. It's made up of the words meta, which means with, and lambano, which means to take or receive. Okay, so those that were wise actually received oil in their vessels. And the other point that I wanted to make is, if you look at the word vessels, it's this word right here, and I just copy and pasted it, but I'll show you the definition over here first. Okay, it says a vessel, a receptacle, a pail, or a reservoir. This is the word angion, and like I said, I copy and pasted it to see what that could possibly look like. Okay, so if you look at images of this word, you see these type of vessels being depicted over here. I don't really see anything that looks like something that has to do with the lamp. But the other thing that it refers to is blood vessels. It's actually where you get words like angiology or angioplasty. I saw that come up in one of these images. Maybe it was this one, I'm not sure. But it's showing blood vessels. Maybe it was this one. Yeah, that's where I saw angioplasty. And so this word refers to vessels as in a vessel like this, or to blood vessels. Okay, so there's two ways to understand this. You can either interpret this as the wise virgins received oil in their vessels, meaning that they were lugging around some vessels such as this carrying oil with them, or it could be referring to receiving the oil in their vessels, which refers to the entire body, because your blood vessels compose your entire body, as you can see in this picture over here. Okay, so I want to talk more about Holy Communion and how it relates to this scripture over here, but I just want to point out something else that I noticed, because in my previous video I had talked about Zechariah 4, how the candlestick over here refers to the menorah, which is the 7 candlesticks that represents the bride, and how the candlesticks, or the menorah, was being fed by, it says over here, 7 lamps, and a bowl that was on top of the menorah. And so I looked at the word in the Greek over here for the 7 lamps, and I noticed it was a form of the word that I had talked about in my last video, which is this word right here. This word is the word lichni, and this is the plural form of the word lichnos, which I had talked about in my previous video. Okay, so what I did is I just copy and pasted this word and saw that it came up in the Strong's one time. As you can see over here, there's, well, it says 14 occurrences, but there's just one occurrence of this particular form of the word that's in the plural, and that was coming up in Luke 12 verse 35. Okay, so I took a look at the scripture, and this is where it says, "Let your loins be girded about, and your lights burning, and ye yourselves like unto men that wait for the Lord when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, they may open unto him immediately. Blessed are those servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you, that he shall gird himself, and make them to sit down to meat, and will come forth and serve them." Okay, so it's saying here to have your loins girded about. And so if you look at the word loins in the Greek, it's the word osphes, and this word means the hip or loin, to gird about the loins, a loin, the 2 loins, the place where the Hebrews thought the generative power or semen resided, or by extension the procreative power over here. So it's basically talking about the loin area, and to have your loins girded. The word gird is this word over here in the Greek. It's actually a form of the word belt, which I'll show you in a minute, but it says to fasten garments with a girdle or belt, to gird oneself, metaphorically with truth as a girdle, to equip oneself with knowledge of the truth, to fasten on one's belt. And I'll talk a little bit more about the word belt. Well, actually, I'll go ahead and show it to you. It comes from this word over here, which is Strong's number 2224. And I've mentioned this word before, because this Strong's number comes from this one, which is 2223. And so I've talked about how these are numbers having to do with DNA, and this is the word belt or girdle over here in the Greek. It's Strong's number 2223. And as I've mentioned before, there's 22 autosomes, or 2 sets of 22 autosomes in the human body, and a total of 23, including the sex chromosomes. So these numbers have to do with DNA. It's saying it's coming from this word, which is another word that I've talked about before. This word refers to the yolk. I've talked about how the yolk refers to DNA, and it's interesting that that comes up with Strong's number 2218. Of course, this is the year 2018. But when the Bible talks about the yoke being broken or lifted, I've talked about how that refers to DNA. Over here it says to join, especially by a yoke, and I've talked about the scripture that says to not be yoked with unbelievers, and I believe that comes up in verse 14. Okay, that's actually in 2 Corinthians 6 verses 14 through 17, and I've talked about how this refers to the division or the separation that's going to take place, that it talks about starting from Genesis 2 verses 14 through 17 and 18. Okay, so I didn't mean to get sidetracked with that, but I've talked about the yoke before and the significance of what that means. And so that's where the word belt comes from, which is another word having to do with DNA. And as you can see, it's Strong's number 2223 and 2224. Of course, Jesus had 24 chromosomes, and this is where the word gird comes from, which refers to a girdle. And I've talked about how the word girdle refers to DNA. This is actually Strong's 4024, but it comes from 2224. Okay, I've talked about how the word girdle represents DNA, and over here it's talking about the curious girdle of the ephod, and I've talked about how the ephod represents DNA, and I'll just show you some images. I just put in ephod and DNA so you can see that I'm not the only one that has come up with that idea that it represents DNA. But I've talked about how the fine twined linen represents DNA, and that the curtain in the temple was made out of blue, purple, and scarlet thread of needlework that was a fine twined linen. I actually realized that when I saw the word helix come up in a table, exactly where it was talking about the fine twined linen. Okay, but I just want to show you this scripture right here. I've talked about before how it seems to come up in verse 11, or numbers having to do with DNA, but over here in Jeremiah 13:11 it says, "For as the girdle cleaveth to the loins of a man, so have I caused to cleave unto me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah," that would be the Jews and the Gentiles, saith the Lord, "that they might be for me a people, and for a name, and for a praise, and for a glory. But they would not hear." So it was always God's plan for the entire house of Israel, which is made up of Jews and Gentiles, to cleave unto him, because they represent the bride, represents the two witnesses, which is the temple of God. That's why it's in Revelation 11 where God tells John to measure the temple right before it begins to talk about the two witnesses that make up the temple of God, or the two candlesticks. Okay, getting back to Luke 12:35, it says, "Let your loins be girded about, and your lights burning, and ye yourselves like unto men that wait for the Lord when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, they may open unto him immediately. Blessed are those servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you, he shall gird himself and make them to sit down to meat, and will come forth and serve them." And if you look at the word sit down to meat, you see that it's the word anaklino, and that word means to lean against, lean upon, to lay down, to make bid, or to recline. And when you look at the word serve them, it's the word diakonio in the Greek, which means to be a servant, attendant, to wait at a table, to minister, or to supply food.